Thank you for joining us tonight, everyone, for our second town hall discussion with Christine Margiotta, titled Tackling Today's Crisis and Building a Better Tomorrow. My name is Phalana TIller. I'm co-chair of Christine's campaign, and I'll be serving as your moderator tonight. Behind the scenes, committee members Josue Barnes and Rachel Forrester will be monitoring the meeting and making sure we get to as many of your questions as possible. The meeting is being recorded, and it may be broadcast at a later date so that more community members can learn and ask questions. It's designed to first give Christine an opportunity to present some prepared thoughts, and then we'll open up the floor to your live questions. For now, your audio is muted. When the time comes and you're moved to type in a question, please do that in the chat function. Make sure to direct your questions to Rachel Forrester, who will consolidate any duplicate questions, and then I'll read them for everyone to hear and for Christine to answer during the Q&A. So, it is now my pleasure to introduce Christine Margiotta. She and I have only worked together for a few months, and upon learning of her candidacy and her very hard to ignore work history, then seeing her very measured yet exciting vision for Claremont, I was fully on board to work to get her elected. I've developed great confidence that as a seasoned leader with executive experience and as a systems thinker, Christine is well prepared for the role she seeks to fill as a Claremont City Councilwoman. I'm convinced that her experience handling massive budgets, in some cases in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and her expertise in managing people, organizations, and projects addressing large-scale challenges with tangible consequences for people's lives is what truly distinguishes her as a candidate. Now, I know that her name may not be as familiar to you as some of the other candidates in this race, but I have jokingly analogized this choice for myself as a voter as akin to needing surgery to remove a brain tumor and having to decide between the 2 or 3 competent, friendly general physicians on my block or the slightly less familiar but seasoned neurosurgeon who has actually performed many such operations. So for me, the choice is clear. I'd hate to be running against her, and I think we'd be very fortunate to have her on our city council. As some of you may already know, Christine grew up in Claremont. She attended our local schools and graduated from Scripps College. Christine is currently the executive director of Social Venture Partners Los Angeles. She's also the chair of the LA County Measure H Citizens Oversight Advisory Board, and has volunteered with and advised Claremont Change, Sustainable Claremont, CHIRP, and in our local elementary schools. Welcome, and thank you for your candidacy, Christine.
Thank you so much, Phalana, and big thanks to you, Phalana, for moderating tonight, and to Josue and Rachel for supporting tonight's forum, and to all of you for taking the time to join us on a Monday night. I'm really grateful you're here and looking forward to talking with you tonight. So as Phalana mentioned, I spent my childhood here in Claremont, went to Scripps College. My first apartment was down the street at the Plum Tree Apartments. And now Claremont is home for our family, for my wife, Becky, and I, and our 2 young kids. And as I think about my roots here in Claremont, I think about the ways that time set the foundation for the last 20 years of my life. So for the last 2 decades, I've dedicated my career, as Phalana said, to strengthening our region, to working across Los Angeles County, which of course includes Claremont, to tackle issues like homelessness, addiction, economic and racial justice, and a whole range of issues that our community is grappling with. Through that, I've developed a range of skills, coalition building abilities, and relationships across this whole region that I'm eager to bring to the work on the Claremont City Council. So when I think about tonight's theme, I'm aware that today, for our family at least, is the 6-month mark of staying at home. So on March 13th, our schools closed down, and March 14th began what has been a much longer journey than we expected of staying at home. So many anxieties and fears and uncertainties were facing our family, as I'm sure they were for all of you. And I've been so mindful of what the impact has been of these last 6 months on our residents and on our communities. So I know for us, we've been juggling homeschooling our kids, my wife and I both working full-time, I lost my dad right before this time started, so also being mindful of supporting my mom, who's now living alone, having friends who are grappling with COVID, with social isolation, with losing their jobs, just so many struggles in our community that as I reflected on what can I do to be a support, I realized that stepping into this campaign was the way that I could bring the last 2 decades of my life into the Claremont community to support our communities as we navigate this time and really importantly, as we set the foundation for our future. My background is in social work. I received my master's degree in social work about 20 years ago. And I think about the way that foundation has prepared me for this moment. I have so enjoyed on this campaign the opportunity to talk to residents, to hear the concerns and struggles of individuals, and mindful of how my career has really focused on listening to those concerns and struggles, and then leading coalitions and organizations to really tackle those challenges on the community-wide level. So I'm eager to talk with you tonight about what the road ahead can look like for Claremont and to hear from you your concerns and ideas for the future.
Thanks, Christine. So let's get started with some of my questions. So this town hall is titled Tackling Today's Crisis and Building a Better Tomorrow. So it's notable that you've elected to refer to a single crisis when some might argue that we're actually dealing with multiple crises right now. Can you help our audience understand why you framed it this way, and then what it means to build a better tomorrow?
Yeah, so absolutely. We are facing multiple crises, and it is the simultaneity of these issues that creates such a unique challenge in this moment. It is exponentially complex as a singular moment in time that is nothing like what this country has ever seen. So I think about the ways that for the last 6 months, there are 4 interrelated challenges that are deeply complex, and any one of them alone would be plenty for us to grapple with. So first and most obviously, I think about the pandemic, right? We've been grappling with COVID-19 around the globe. 29 million people have suffered through COVID around the world. 928,000 people have died, including 10 people right here in Claremont. So we're facing this massive health crisis that has then created an economic crisis. We have 13% unemployment in our state, struggles with social isolation, mental health, addiction being on the rise, and our schools. Any of us who are parents are grappling with our children struggling to keep up in a distance learning environment, while also grappling with home life. And for all of us, for our youth, our seniors, our family, being mindful about the toll this is taking on our physical and mental well-being. So as if that weren't enough, in the midst of this, our country, and no coincidence that these challenges are intersecting in this moment. At the same time, we've also been seeing what many have called the largest social movement in our country's history, as we grapple with 400 years of racism in this country and the unjust killing of Black and brown people in our communities. So we've seen a global uprising that has also taken root right here in Claremont as well. Now, on top of that, over the last week, I think all of us have been so mindful of the climate crisis as well. So last weekend, we were facing temperatures of 115 degrees, and now seeing wildfires take over the state of California, tens of thousands of acres burning all across the state. And we just have to step outside to see the ash covering our sidewalks to know how this is affecting our air quality and our quality of life right now. So now, when it was already challenging enough to be staying at home, now we're also facing this additional layer of needing to stay inside. So such an acute reminder of the climate crisis we're facing. And finally, as we prepare for the November election, I think so many of us are acutely aware of the challenges with the erosion of our sense of democracy in this country. Our faith in institutions has dwindled. We struggle to trust our press. Our postal service is being diminished, questions with CDC, so many institutions that we grew up trusting are now being called into question, and that foundation, the foundation feels so much shakier than ever. So I think about these four intersecting and overlapping challenges, crises in our community. And as we look back in history, any one of these has been enough to make our history books. We look back on the Great Depression, the pandemic of 1918, the wars that we've endured over this century, the aftermath of September 11th, and of course, what has always been this undercurrent of racial injustice in this country. And any one of those has been monumental. And here we are grappling with all four of these simultaneously. So as we talked about tonight's conversation, we really thought about the ways that this is a crisis in that uniqueness of all of these challenges coming together at once. So as I think about this campaign and the challenges of this moment, and what it is to step into city leadership in Claremont in this moment and beyond, I think about the challenges of both navigating this current crisis and the incredible importance of being mindful of the future and thinking about how the foundation that we lay today is what we'll be relying on for decades to come, and how, as we look at these crises, they also are the result of cracks in our foundation from decades and centuries in this country and right here in this community. So I am eager to step into and to create a new future for this community that springs from the ways that our eyes have been opened in this moment.
Would you, Christine, tell our audience a little bit about your history and how you think it's genuinely positioned you to be ready to help us here in Claremont to tackle this moment?
There are three things I think about in my background that led me to step into this campaign, to say, this is a job that I can tackle. So the first is I've had extensive experience raising funds and responsibly handling large sums of money. I've managed large budgets throughout my career. So I am, as Phalana mentioned at the beginning, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Social Venture Partners Los Angeles. I've been in this role for the last 4 years, and in that time have doubled our budget and have done so in a way that is sustainable for the long term. So thinking about what will set that solid foundation for this organization. When I worked for United Way of Greater Los Angeles, I built a public-private partnership there that resulted in a budget of $250 million that was then invested in solutions for homelessness. And now I am the chair of the Measure H Citizens Oversight Advisory Board for the County of Los Angeles, where we oversee the implementation of $300 million of resources that is distributed all throughout this county. So as I think about what it will take to really navigate the challenges in this city and the road ahead, I think a lot about our budget. And I think about the ways that we will need to spend our existing resources as wisely as possible to think about where every dollar is going to the best impact possible for our residents, for our community. I think about how we build new revenue, not only thinking about looking to new taxes and new revenue, generating ideas for our community, but also about how we leverage regional resources. How do we build the partnerships across this region that will draw in additional resources to this community? So I mentioned the work that I did at United Way to build those public-private partnerships. We started with a seed grant of $1 million, and we approached then our philanthropic partners, our government partners across the region, and said, we could be so much stronger if we pooled our resources. This was back in the economic downturn of 2008. We knew in that moment there was not an opportunity for new resources. So we said, let's leverage what we have. Let's do more with our existing resources. And that $1 million became $5 million, became $105 million in that first year. So we had $105 million in government and philanthropic resources that we were then able to focus on the most important needs in our community. So that's the kind of creativity that I'm eager to bring to our resources as we look at the budget for Claremont now and beyond. The second thing that I think about is my history of bringing together stakeholders to tackle really complex issues. So for the last 20 years, I've led organizations, I've led teams and coalitions that span across sectors and across the political spectrum. So it's something I enjoy doing, is looking at how does this puzzle fit together? What's the vision? What are we trying to accomplish as a community? And how do all of these sectors come together to tackle what it is that we're trying to accomplish? So I've created partnerships with the Chamber of Commerce, with philanthropic institutions across the region, with labor unions, faith communities, really worked across sectors to say, what can each of us do to accomplish this shared vision? In that time, in the public-private partnership I mentioned, we were able to support 35,000 people who were sleeping on our streets, people who were experiencing homelessness. 35,000 people moved off the streets and into permanent housing over the course of 5 years because of those partnerships that were built, because we said, we have a common goal here, let's work together to get there. So those are both relationships that I want to bring here to Claremont, but also a track record of coalition building and a skill set that I'm eager to bring to bear to help us navigate this crisis. And the third piece I think about is I'm very comfortable confronting discomfort. I know that this work, that leadership requires hard conversations and difficult decisions. So every once in a while, you know, I know that those tough conversations may require abstaining and keeping quiet, but for me, that's not something I lean on. I really lean into difficult conversations because I know that's what it takes to get us to the other side. So I've been in that tough situation of needing to let go of staff, struggling with a declining budget, walking away from dysfunctional contracts. I've made those hard decisions. And I'm also comfortable with difficult conversations. So I think about my time in the aftermath of Prop 8 when we were working to secure same-sex marriage across the state of California. I think about knocking on doors and coming out to voters and telling them my personal story about why marriage mattered to me. I also facilitate a course on anti-racism and talk with people about why it's necessary for us to talk about these challenging issues and to step into that discomfort if we want to create something better. So I think about how in the coming years, you know, one example that comes to mind in 2021, we'll be navigating our housing element process, which is essentially our local requirement to identify, in this case, 1,700 units of housing that this community will create in the coming years. Now, I know that's been a really challenging conversation in this community, and one that I've navigated for the last 2 decades as we talk about how we create the housing to meet the needs of communities all across this region, including Claremont. So as we think about where and how we create 1,700 units of housing here in Claremont, all across this city, that will require those hard conversations and all of us stepping into that discomfort together to get to a shared vision of what that can look like. So those are some of the things that are top of mind as I think about stepping into this role.
Thank you. I have one last question before we turn to the audience for their questions. My last question is, so as we start to think about, as you have said, building a better tomorrow, what are some actual concrete specific ideas that you'd want to see Claremont embrace in pursuit of that very lofty goal?
So there are a few things that are top of mind for me as I think about navigating this crisis and stepping into a stronger tomorrow. So as I mentioned, our budget has been top of mind. So I think we will need to set a budget process that takes into account the needs of this community comprehensively. We can't just say, well, what did we spend last year and where do we need to cut? I want us to look holistically at what does our community need? What do our seniors need? What do our youth need? What do our young families need? What are the comprehensive needs facing this community? What do we have in our budget? How can we align what we have to those needs? And then if we see a gap there, how can we then grow new revenue? So we know Measure CR lost by a very slim margin. So it may be that we return to the voters with a sales tax or some revenue measure like that. There's also an opportunity for a property transfer fee, which for a small fee on a property that's sold, we could bring in over $500,000 in revenue a year. So we have options here, but that has to be on the heels of a comprehensive vision for this community about what those funds will accomplish. We can't just ask voters to fill a budget shortfall. I often talk about the fundraising work that I do in our nonprofit. You know, we don't approach our donors and say, hey, we're having a tough time meeting payroll. Can you donate to our organization? We say, here's this inspiring vision that we're trying to accomplish. Will you partner with us in accomplishing that vision? And I think that's, if we are to ask voters for additional revenue, for additional tax measures, that's the conversation we need to be having, is here is the shared vision. Will you support us? Can we together step into that reality? I also think about the challenges of our local renters. So across Claremont, 30% of our residents are renters. And we know that 55% of them are experiencing rent burden right now, meaning more than 30% of their income is going to their rent. Now we have a countywide eviction moratorium right now, but that's not being enforced effectively all across the county. So we need to look here in Claremont at how we uphold that policy and how we strengthen that locally, strengthen that implementation. We need to consider an emergency rent stabilization for our renters during this time, which communities all across the country have been considering. And I think as we look forward to the future of housing, we also need to look at strengthening our inclusionary housing policy. We have built thousands of units in this community, and yet in the last several years of development, none of that housing has been affordable to people of low or very low income. So how can we ensure that our housing is affordable to anyone who wants to live in this city, that we send a message that everyone is welcome in this city, as our city mission touts that we are an inclusive community. I also think about how we support our small businesses. How can we support businesses navigate this challenging time, adapt their businesses to the current needs, and support them financially, both through local resources and to supporting them in accessing federal resources. And finally, I think about our climate crisis that we talked about at the beginning, and how can we set bold goals here for a real climate plan here in Claremont, to think about as we revisit our sustainability plan, but also to think boldly about how we set some concrete goals to achieve carbon neutrality in the near term. So those are some of the ideas that have been top of mind for me, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts and questions as well.
Well, thank you very much for answering my questions, Christine. I'd now like to invite everyone who is here with us to please send your questions to Rachel via the chat function. And as I mentioned earlier, she's going to make sure that I can see those, and then I will read them to all of you and to Christine so that she can respond. So I'll take a moment here to scan for a question. Bear with me just a second, please. So Christine, we have a question, which I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Meg Mathies, or Matthias, Meg Matthias, but Meg asks a question that's related to budget again. How would you solve Claremont's financial problems? So it's kind of maybe a broad question, but you have an opportunity to, I think, approach that.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Meg. So I am mindful that our community has a structural deficit. We have an $800,000 current deficit that is anticipated to grow to over 2.5 million by the year 23-24. So as we look at our budget, it's so critical that we plan for that long term. So as I mentioned earlier, I really see the need for a comprehensive budgeting process. So though we budget 1 year at a time right now in our city, it's important that we look at a longer horizon than a single year as we tackle a structural deficit, as we face this economic downturn. We need to look at the 5-year, 10-year, 20-year horizon for this city and to ask ourselves, what are the most important uses of these precious resources in our city? So we have a general fund of over $26 million in this community. How are we spending those resources to the best impact possible? So again, to return to that question of need, what is it that our community most needs now and into the future? And how is our budget meeting those needs, or how is it falling short of meeting those needs? And where it does fall short, how are we asking ourselves, what are the other resources we can leverage? Where are there opportunities in county government to partner with surrounding cities to tackle some of these challenges? You know, it can be so tempting as a city to see our problems as Claremont challenges and to just focus in a more insular way within the city. But our neighbors are struggling with these problems, and what could we do as a community, as a region, if we leverage our resources with one another, draw in additional county funds, state funds, federal funds. And as I said, you know, then at that point, if we're still not able to make all the pieces add up, how do we then consider going back to our voters for new revenue? And to do so with that vision in mind. So to consider a sales tax, a transient occupancy tax for our visitors, the property transfer tax. You know, how can we look at these different options as we shore up not only our budget for the coming year, but for the long term?
Thank you, Christine. I'll just remind everyone to do direct your questions to Rachel when you send them in the chat function, and she'll make sure I get them. I did see a question here from Natalie Shiras, who asks you, Christine, what is your vision for how the Claremont Police can be trained to be attentive to cultural sensitivity and cultural humility so that Black and Brown people are not stopped or apprehended at a greater rate than white people?
Yeah, this is such an important issue, and one that we've been hearing from Black and Brown residents across Claremont that has been a challenge. One thing I appreciate at the recent police commission meeting, our commission did request that there be a full data analysis to understand what's happening. You know, we know that there are disproportionalities in arrests. So Black residents represent 18% of arrests through our Claremont Police Department and represent only 5% of the population. Similarly, Latinx folks represent 48% of arrests and are only 26% of our population. So we know there are disproportionalities there that it's important that we address as a community, and to understand where in the process, where is the challenge in this process? Where is it implicit bias at the individual level? And where is it structural? Where are our policies creating these disproportionate outcomes? So it's important that we look at that at both of those levels. And, you know, as we think about our budget as well, you know, I think about what our Claremont Police Department is being asked to respond to. Right now, in the last year, we know they responded to over 1,000 calls on homelessness. 25% of their arrests were for substance abuse. So our police are being asked to respond to crises that are for which another tool is better suited, right? Those are human services challenges. Addiction is not something that law enforcement can solve. Homelessness is not something that law enforcement can solve. You know, on a recent call, the CPD was remarking on the way that they pass a hat around when they meet someone experiencing homelessness after hours so that they can find a hotel room for them for the night. And while I appreciate that dedication and commitment on behalf of our officers, that is not the solution. That is not where our community resources should be focused to solve these challenges. So I also want us to look closely at how we're responding to crises in our community with people who are experiencing challenges, and to think about how we can shift to a human services response in those moments.
Thank you. We have a question from Ken Schultz, who says, do you have any concerns regarding the proposed 96-unit housing project north of the old schoolhouse that passed the City Council this week?
So I know this has been a big topic of conversation in our community and right here in our district, as have been developments all over the city of Claremont. So I think it's incredibly important that we are mindful of how these developments move forward. So because I will, if I'm to be elected, I will need to vote on issues that relate to these developments. I've been encouraged to not comment on the specifics of them. But what I will say, having worked on housing development on a community level for a couple decades now, and having worked closely with community as we think about how and where to create new housing in our communities, I think that process and that collaboration with local residents is critical. It's so important that we start at the very beginning, having conversations with the neighbors of a potential new development. And that goes for anywhere that new housing is being sited in this community. And as I talked about earlier, having those difficult conversations. How do we talk about what it means for our neighborhood to change, right? Any new development is a change, and how do we partner around what that change looks like, and how do we have a shared vision for how that will come to fruition, and how that new development can truly meet the needs of the community. So, to my earlier point, if we have a housing need in this community of 1,700 units, how will those 96 units support the people who most need housing in this community, and how will it enhance and support the neighborhood that it's being situated in? So those are some of the things I think about with these developments, and I think it's really important that we continue to have conversations with the entire community, but particularly with our neighbors in each of these potential developments.
Again, I'd like to invite everyone who has a burning question to please put it forward and direct it to Rachel, if you would. And I'll sit tight until someone comes through. While we're waiting, Christine, I do have a question for you around, we're a lot of us who come to Claremont, we're people who come because of the colleges, right? And a lot of people who think of Claremont associate it with the colleges. And I'm one of those people who decided to move here after accepting a role at one of the institutions. And part of what I've been thinking a lot about lately is how, the colleges and the town are sort of symbiotic, right? One isn't really great without the other. I think, the colleges are a wonderful place because they're situated in Claremont. Claremont's this beautiful town where if you come here as a student, if you come here as a staff, faculty, it's a great place to live. Speakers who come to visit, all kinds of folks who get to experience it for the first time, even for a brief time, really get to feel like these colleges are set in a beautiful town. And then the colleges themselves are an incredible resource for the town. We have seniors who can take courses there. We have, all the relationships with mentors and folks that can kind of contribute to the community, and all sorts of beautiful campuses to walk your dog in. And I've been sort of curious about this incredible shift that's taking place because of the COVID crisis, and because of the fact that students can't be in residence right now, which is impacting staff, all kinds of staff on the campuses, because their services aren't needed, and therefore their jobs are sometimes are threatened. And I just am interested if you've had some time to think about the relationship between the city and the colleges, and kind of how you, if you might talk a little bit about your experiences having grown up here and then studied here and now deciding to come back here, and how that's maybe impacting your view on how you would manage that relationship and care for that relationship were you to serve in council.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the colleges were a big part of why my parents chose to move here and raise us here. There's such an incredible asset to this community. And yet I find the relationship between our college's community, the 7 colleges, their students, their faculty and staff, and the rest of the Claremont community is sometimes a fractured one. So I think about my experience as a Scripps College student, and we were not necessarily engaged in what was going on in the broader community. We were rarely brought into the broader community dialogue. Even though I had grown up here, I felt this disconnect in living there. And similarly, now, again, raising our young kids here, our children went to the children's school, which is based at Claremont McKenna College. And in the midst of the pandemic, they chose to close the preschool. And that was a decision that was, I would say, pretty heartbreaking for the families that had their children there. And it was a decision made without much conversation with us as parents. And so I find that that has often been the case in our relationships across the community and the colleges, that there is somewhat of a disconnect where we can really build a bridge and solve problems together. So I think about our commissions across the city of Claremont and how much each commission would benefit from having representatives from the college sit on each of those commissions, to sit on the same side of the table to solve some of these challenges that are in front of us. Imagine if we were together asking ourselves, how do we best care for this community? How do we set the path forward on revenue, on climate, on caring for our youth or our seniors? I think that would be a very different conversation than the community, which often doesn't include the colleges, problem solving, and then bringing proposals to our colleges or vice versa. So I think there's great opportunity for much more dialogue there in a way that will be much more fruitful when we think about the outcomes and some of the decisions that we're making as a city or as a community of colleges.
Thank you. We have a question from Gary Mizumoto, who says, as of June 2018, Claremont's unfunded CalPERS pension liability is $56.6 million and has continued to grow since then. Is this a threat to overwhelm Claremont's budget? And if so, what solutions would you recommend?
Yes, this is, as we talk about the structural deficit, this is one of our biggest challenges as a city, and one that I've already begun talking to Adam Peary about in the city, to ask, what is it that we see in this road ahead, and how can we tackle this together? And this is something our city is not alone in asking this question. It's critical that we have the tough conversation around our pension liability, to think about that as part of this whole conversation around our budget and around how do we face this tough conversation, and again, how can we get on the same side of the table with the stakeholders in that conversation all across the city, and have the conversation about this is a problem that we need to solve together. So as we look at our budget and as we consider new revenue, we can't ignore why it is that we're in the situation that we are. That is absolutely something that we need to tackle head on.
We have a question from someone who'd like to know how you will support seniors in our community through this crisis and beyond.
So I mentioned in the top of the conversation that my mom lives nearby, and we lost my dad right as the pandemic was starting. And I've been so mindful of what her challenges have been through this time. And in talking with seniors across Claremont, I'm aware of what this time has meant. I know that seniors are the fastest growing population in Claremont. 1 in 5 of our residents are seniors, and such a vital and important part of our community. So I think about, in the short term, how can we protect our seniors, both around the health crisis. There's a major dialogue at City Council and across the city about how we can ensure that we're protecting one another's health and safety by wearing masks. A very simple action that all of us can take. My mom talks about being afraid to go out and check her mail because people are taking walks without their masks on, and she's nervous to leave the house right now. And then connected to that, I'm mindful of the social isolation that seniors are experiencing now, that so many people across our community are experiencing, but particularly our seniors who have relied on our community services, who have relied on the Jocelyn Center and other spaces where we can gather, that now we need to be more creative than ever about how we tackle that social isolation and think about, what does social connection look like now? How can we connect virtually? And for those that don't have access to a virtual space, how can we create ways to connect through this time and beyond? Another challenge that I've heard from seniors across this region is the challenge of affordable housing. That's been one of the biggest questions that's come up in conversation. And as I've mentioned, I think for those who are renters, we need to think about renter protections, eviction moratoriums, and rent stabilization, and the creation of more affordable housing across this community. That's one of the most important resources that we can shore up for the future, is ensuring that our housing is affordable to those on a fixed income, to those who are to low income. That's one of the biggest questions that I hear from folks across this city. So I'm mindful of the incredibly strong network that we have of senior services here. I want to ensure those services are protected, but also strengthened, and that we think about how we can be creative in rethinking those services, rethinking particularly around social connection through this time and beyond.
Thank you. We also have a question from Ben McCoy, who's interested to know your thoughts on concrete methods that help to increase diversity, that could help to increase diversity in Claremont.
Mm-hmm. So I think about diversity on so many different dimensions. So I'd be curious for more about what you think of when you ask that question. I know for many, we think about racial diversity when we think of diversity. And what I have been struck by is this community is 50% of our residents are Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian American. 50% of our residents are folks of color, and 50% are white. And I think about representation in this community and how we're ensuring that we have a multitude of voices that are representative of our community. So along our racial diversity, our socioeconomic diversity, how are we ensuring, a range of people of different socioeconomic backgrounds can access and thrive here in Claremont, that this is a place where our seniors and our youth can thrive. So young people ages 5 to 20 are the fastest declining population here in Claremont. So while seniors are on the rise, our youth are on the decline. So asking ourselves, why is that? And I've spoken about it a few times, and it's an issue I'm passionate about. But our housing is one of the top things that I hear people mention when they talk about the inaccessibility of Claremont as a community to raise their young children. So how are we thinking about diversity across all of that whole spectrum, and living up to our stated value of inclusion in this community? And I believe much of that starts with the representation, again, as we think about our commissions, the seats of power in this community. How are we thinking about representation across all of those realms of diversity? And that's something that's really important to me as we think about the future of this city, that this truly be a welcoming and diverse city for anyone who wants to make Claremont home.
We have a question from Keith Tennis, who asks, I think parenthetically, he says, what do you see your role as an elected person? So if you were an elected person, you're not there yet, but were you to be elected, how do you see your role as representative of, are you representing the people of your district mainly, or educating us about what we need? So I'm not sure if those are necessarily dichotomous, but you can approach that however you wish, Christine. And then he continues with, how do we get around the NIMBY attitude when it comes to affordable housing?
Mm-hmm. I feel like this is one of the age-old questions on policy making, is Do the elected leaders lead the people, or do the people lead our elected leaders? And I think the answer is yes, right? That we've seen examples throughout history of both of those, where in some cases our leaders have needed to have the moral courage to step forward on an issue that is for the best of the community in times when the will of the people wasn't quite there yet. And other cases, much like we're seeing now, where there are massive uprisings, where the people are saying to their elected leaders, you must do what's right. You must take this action, even though it's uncomfortable, even though you'll receive pushback. So that's something I've always really appreciated about public policy, that it is a both and in these different moments. And I have often, for the last 20 years, I've been the one building the will of the people to speak to our elected officials to say, here's what needs to happen. So I'm mindful of the importance of listening to community and to hearing our residents in what their greatest concerns are. And particularly, whatever the given issue is, listening closely to those who are directly impacted by that issue. How are we hearing the voices of our community, of what they're struggling with, what their challenges are? And you mentioned NIMBYism. I think, how do we talk about what the fears are as well? What are we afraid of in any given change that we're stepping into? And how can we look at what's the greater vision that we have for what's possible for the future? I've found, and I say this a lot, I think, when we have shared vision, when we have shared purpose and goals, everything else is just tactics, and everything else, we can figure out the details if we know where it is that we want to go, and we're aligned around that shared purpose. So that's so often been the case as I think about housing and homelessness work across this region, as we worked across the aisle, across the political spectrum to build the needed resources. That's often what it's taken, is one, having a vision of what does this community need, and then asking ourselves together, well, how are we going to get there? What are the resources we need? And in this case, you mentioned housing. We need 1,700 units of new housing in this community. How do we ensure that that's all across this region in all 5 districts? And that we really have the conversations with local residents about what that looks like, how that aligns with the look and feel of our communities, and how we ensure that we, I think as much as possible, talk through the fears that folks have. I've found that NIMBYism, is not a permanent state of being. It's a temporary state of fear that we can move through together when we talk through what those fears are and how we can mitigate them.
Thank you. There's a question from David and Karen Lull, wondering, what have you discovered about the differences or similarities between the Pilgrim Place end of District 1 and north of Foothill? For example, one assumption is that we down here are more supportive of new tax revenues, but not so much north of Foothill. Have you found that to be the case, or what do you think about all of that?
I so appreciated the opportunity to talk to residents across this district. And I'll say we have supporters of our campaign all across this district. So as you say, north of Baseline, north of Foothill, south of Foothill, the whole region, there are enthusiastic supporters of our campaign. And what I hear across that is an investment in the future of this community, a passion and a love for this city, and an investment in wanting to create shared purpose for the future of this city, that this recognition that we are at an inflection point, and it's up to us now to set the path for the future. So while I think, you can look at the census tracts from 2016, 2018, and you can certainly see political differences across our city on how residents voted on a given measure or a candidate. But I think more than anything, as I think across my career, I think about the times that I've worked across the aisle on different issues, including issues of new revenue. So I worked closely with the Chamber of Commerce to place a measure called HHH and another countywide measure called Measure H on the ballot. Those were both new tax revenues that required 2/3 of voters to vote to tax themselves, right? Twice. For folks in the city of LA, they tax themselves twice and across the county once. But in both cases required 2/3 vote to pass. And, you know, I think about the bridges that were necessary to make that possible, and these partnerships to listen to, oh, okay, we do want the same thing here, and it's often how we get there or how we talk about how we're getting there that is what differs. So again, I've found that we have so much more in common than we do that separates us. Everyone is grappling with this pandemic, you know, these four interrelated challenges and crises that I mentioned earlier. Everyone is grappling with those, and everyone wants to set a stronger future. And I think often what we've skipped over in this city is pausing to say, what is it that we want here? Where are we going together? And then talking about how we're going to get there. We've gone straight to the how, and then we fight over the how, but that's because we've skipped over the why. And that's the conversation we've been able to create on this campaign that I think has really brought people across this district together.
So we do have time for maybe one or two more questions. If anyone would like to send a question to Rachel in the chat. And if there are no questions, which is absolutely fine, I will just carry on and acknowledge that I'm so grateful that all of you joined us here tonight. And I really appreciate you, Christine, for taking the time to kind of think about all these things. And I'm really, excited about your willingness to run for a position on the Claremont City Council, especially under these circumstances. I know how much you care and how hard you'll work for our entire community, and I invite you to share any last thoughts or words with us, Christine.
Thank you so much, Phalana. I really appreciate you moderating tonight. And again, thanks to Josue and Rachel for making everything work so smoothly behind the scenes. And to each of you for joining us on a Monday evening and for your investment in this city. I know how much people across Claremont care about this community, and I want you to know how deeply I care about it too. For all of our residents, for our kids and for their future, and for all of our community's kids. I'm so eager to set the path for a far better future for them than what we're seeing out our doors right now. I'd be really proud to earn all of your votes and all of your support. I'll invite you to come to our website. It's christineforclaremont.com. We'll drop that into the chat as well. If you are ready and willing to commit to our campaign, we would love to add you as an endorser. We'd love to bring you a yard sign, invite your contributions to our campaign. We're really building momentum here over the last couple months and building this groundswell of community members who are ready to step into the future of this city. So I'd be so proud to create that with you and proud to earn your vote. I'm happy to chat offline. If you have additional questions, you can reach out to me at christineforclaremont@gmail.com. Come to additional meet and greets. Definitely want to continue this conversation over the next couple months and well beyond that. I'll just say thank you all again so much for coming, and I hope we can continue the conversation.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.